pleasure to be here tonight to welcome you. My name is Diana McCluskey and I'm the Vice President at the Queensland branch of the AIIA. Paul is not with us today as our President, so yes, I get the delight to welcome you tonight. And just a bit of housekeeping quickly, just anybody's got any phones, would you mind putting those on mute? And also anybody online, if they could put their cameras and also their sound on mute as well, that'd be great. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Jagera people who are traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet tonight, and pay my respects to their ancestors and their descendants. And tonight we have an amazing speaker who is joining us from Canberra. So I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Abul Rizvi, who is currently the Special Advisor at Mitchelson Alexander. He is an economics, accounting and public policy graduate from ANU and has recently completed a PhD in population and immigration policy. From 1991 to 95, he was the Immigration Department's Chief Financial Officer before managing Australia's migration program from 1995 to 2007. He commissioned research on the demographic, economic and budgetary impact of immigration that was extensively used in the policy development, including the 2002 Intergenerational Report. This research led to major policy changes to expand Australia's international education industry, skilled temporary migration, and working holiday makers as a pathway to an expanded permanent migration program. This slowed population ageing in Australia and made it a demographic outlier amongst developed nations over the past 20 years. Dr. Rizvi was awarded the Public Service Medal and the Centenary Medal for services to the development and implementation of Australian immigration policy. He is a frequent media commentator on population, immigration and its impact on Australia's economic directions. He recently featured on the SBS documentary Who Gets to Stay in Australia.
That's right.
Dr. Rizvi is the author of the book Population Shock and on the role of Australia's immigration policies in shaping Australia's population and economic policies. Quite a CV.
Yeah.
And I would like to now introduce one of our board members, Graham Kerridge, who will chair tonight's session. And I'd like to invite him up and he will lead the discussion with Abul. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana, and welcome everyone to tonight's session. Now, as Diana has said, we've got a very eminent speaker in this area. And Dr. Rizvi will be making a presentation, and then afterwards there'll be an opportunity for questions. For those online, they can send through questions through the chat function. But firstly, we'll ask Dr. Rizvi to give his presentation, and then there'll be the opportunity for questions. So, Dr. Rizvi, welcome.
Thank you, Grant, and good afternoon, everyone, both online and in Brisbane. I want to posit that since around the 1970s, Australia has had 6 waves of asylum seekers, and each of those has been quite different, and how Australia has managed them has been quite different. And it's worth, I think, just going through a little bit of that history to understand the context of asylum seeker policy today. I think most in the audience will remember, well, those who are old enough will remember the Indo-Chinese boat arrivals of the mid-70s after the Vietnam War. The total number of boat arrivals we actually received at that time was just over 2,000, so a lot smaller than people imagine, and indeed a lot smaller than more recent waves of asylum seekers. Following those boat arrivals, the Australian government under Malcolm Fraser, in conjunction with a range of governments around Southeast Asia and the United States government, implemented what was then called the Comprehensive Plan of Action, which provided for arrangements to try to reduce the rate at which people were leaving Vietnam on boats, mostly because of the issues that were arising in terms of both people dying at sea and the danger of pirates attacking some of those refugee boats. What happened was that a number of countries around Southeast Asia agreed to accept the boat arrivals. Many of them were pushing them back at that point. Agreed to accept the boat arrivals on condition that a range of other countries, predominantly developed countries such as Australia and the United States, would accept those people who had been initially accepted by countries in Southeast Asia. So gradually, Australia accepted around 50,000 Vietnamese boat arrivals, or who had arrived in Southeast Asian countries, and we selected them from refugee camps from those countries. The Comprehensive Plan of Action is generally regarded as a very successful mechanism for managing asylum seekers leaving countries by boat. The second major wave of asylum seekers to Australia was associated with Chinese students who had been in Australia at the time of the Tiananmen Square massacre. That was the 4th of June, 1989. At that point, Bob Hawke announced that all of the students, the Chinese students that were in Australia at that time, would be allowed to remain on the basis of 4-year temporary protection visas, and that those Chinese students who had already lodged applications to that stage would also have their applications processed. Those students also came to Australia and also moved on to 4-year temporary protection visas. Subsequently, under the Keating government, those asylum seekers who didn't actually have their applications for asylum processed, they were just held in abeyance, were provided with a pathway to permanent residence, and eventually around 42,000 people were given permanent residence on that fast-track basis. As I said, their asylum applications were never actually processed. The third major wave of asylum seekers to Australia occurred around the time of Tampa, both before the Tampa arrived in Australia in 2001, that is the late 1990s, through to the point at which Tampa was boarded and the Howard government implemented its policies of, firstly, offshore processing in Nauru and Manus. Secondly, turning back boats that came after that time. Some boats still came after Tampa, but within about 6 months, the turnaround policy was fully implemented, and we had no further boat arrivals after that point. And John Howard also introduced temporary protection visas for those people who were already in Australia and had arrived by boat and were found to be refugees. All up, over around 20,000 people were eventually granted temporary protection, or they were resettled in other countries, predominantly in New Zealand. The boats from about 2002 onwards stopped arriving, and then we move to the fourth major wave of asylum seekers to Australia, which was when the first Rudd government changed policy from 2008 onwards. The Rudd government abolished temporary protection visas, provided all people who were on temporary protection visas at the time with a pathway to permanent residence. It also abolished the policy of turning boats around, and it also abolished offshore processing. That led to a substantial surge in arrival of boats from around 2008 to 2013. I'll come back and talk about the Rudd policy a bit more detail shortly, but I'll just finish off on the other two waves of asylum seekers. These two waves are less well known. From about 2014 to about 2020, when international borders were closed, we had approximately 100,000 asylum seekers arrive by air and then apply for asylum after arrival. Most of them came on visitor visas, and that really only stopped when the international borders were closed. We then have the sixth wave when international borders were reopened, and from 2022 onwards, we've had over 100,000 asylum seekers, once again, primarily people who had arrived on visitor visas, applying for asylum. And I'll talk about that group a little later as well. But I just wanted to start by noting those 6 separate waves and how they differ. So the Rudd government in 2008, as I said, stopped offshore processing, stopped turnbacks, and abolished temporary protection visas in 2007-8. At that point, we had a restart of boat arrivals. That led to the establishment of a very large number of detention centres in Australia. They were detention centres in almost every state, and at around 2013, we had something in the order of 30,000 people in Australia in detention. And you can imagine how big some of those detention centres would have had to been to manage that group. In order to try and stem the flow of boat arrivals, the Gillard government struck an agreement with Malaysia to essentially for Malaysia to accept people who had been found to be refugees in Australia as part of a people swap, whereby Malaysia would accept one person for every 4 people Australia accepted who had been found to be refugees in Malaysia. The objective was to create an incentive for people not to leave Malaysia by boat to head to either Indonesia or directly to Australia, but rather to wait in Malaysia for an opportunity to be resettled in Australia. That agreement was initially struck down by the High Court, and subsequent legislation developed by the Gillard government was defeated in the Senate, where the Coalition and the Greens both voted together to defeat that legislation. During the period the Malaysia agreement had been announced, there had been a slowdown in boat arrivals, but once the agreement had been struck down by the Senate, boat arrivals surged again. The second Rudd government, that is in around mid-2013, reintroduced offshore processing. Boat arrivals fell sharply. Indeed, when Rudd introduced offshore processing, monthly boat arrivals were between 40 and 50 boats per month. By the time the Rudd government was defeated, boat arrivals had fallen to around less than a handful per month. After that, Scott Morrison, as Immigration Minister, reintroduced turnbacks, and a number of boats were turned around. Eventually, that was done in conjunction with the Indonesian government and the Sri Lankan government. And since that point, we have had no further successful boat arrivals to Australia. That brought that wave of boat arrivals to an end, but it did lead to a situation where Australia ended up spending many, many, many billions of dollars operating offshore processing centres and leaving people who had been in Australia on temporary protection visas for a very long time. Essentially, in my view, the striking down of the Malaysia agreement ended up costing Australia a great deal of money, and it cost a lot of people a great deal of misery. It was, I think, an appalling failure of public policy. The Albanese government has approached this issue slightly differently. It has retained turnback policy and it has retained offshore processing capacity. The policy objective is that all of the people on Manus and Nauru will be resettled, most likely in New Zealand, although that is proceeding very slowly, but that because of turnbacks, the offshore processing capacity is hopefully never again used. The temporary protection visas of the 31,000 who had been part of what is known as the legacy caseload, those are people who had arrived by boat prior to the reintroduction of offshore processing by the second Rudd government, have been provided with a pathway to permanent residence. That is approximately 19,000 temporary protection visas. Those processes will proceed this financial year and will probably complete next financial year, such that all of those people are provided permanent residence. And they are, I understand, to be counted as permanent residents in addition to the existing humanitarian program. So in the forthcoming May budget, you will find a line item, a budget measure, which identifies the cost of providing that group with a pathway to permanent residence. However, there remain, out of the 31,000, because only 19,000 have so far been granted temporary protection visas, there are 12,000 who have either been refused at the primary stage, refused at the review stage, or are still being processed. And they, unless they secure also temporary protection visas, the remaining 12,000 at the moment do not have a pathway to permanent residence. They will not be detained or removed, other than perhaps those who may have some security issues, but they remain in limbo. And the question of how the Albanese government will deal with that remains unclear. We then have the group that arrived post the introduction of offshore processing. There is a small group of those people who are still on Nauru and Manus. The bulk of the group is on temporary visas in Australia. They are being offered resettlement in Australia. The Albanese government insists they will not be provided with a pathway to permanent residence as the 19,000 TPV holders have been provided. Unfortunately, the processing of those people for resettlement in New Zealand is proceeding very, very slowly, partly because the number who have put their hands up to be resettled in New Zealand, my understanding is, remains relatively small. And secondly, the New Zealand government appears to be proceeding very slowly. A further problem is that New Zealand has only offered 150 places per annum. That is not going to be enough. The Albanese government will have to negotiate with New Zealand for a larger number. It may be that the processing of those people by New Zealand is proceeding slowly because agreement has not yet been reached between the two nations. Many of you will have heard recently about the Australian and UK boat policies and how Mr. Sunak is using Mr. Abbott's slogan of "Stop the Boats." And much of the media is reporting that the two sets of boat policies are, in essence, the same. That is not strictly true. There are important differences. Firstly, turnbacks. That has now been agreed with Indonesia and the Sri Lankan government, and turnbacks policy remains in place in Australia. In the UK, the negotiations with France are ongoing. It's reported that France has been provided with a commitment to some £500 million to assist with slowing the rate at which people leave France for the UK. How effective that will be is not clear. It's understood that France may be paid to set up a larger detention centre in France to hold people who have attempted to travel by boat to the UK. However, there will continue to be people who leave France on boats, small boats, and head to the UK. Those people will be picked up by the UK government, either on arrival or somewhere in the Channel, and they will be taken for detention somewhere in the UK. In Australia, where those people do get through the turnback arrangements, they would be, in theory, taken directly to Nauru. That is not via Australia, but directly to Nauru, so they don't actually set foot in Australia. The UK situation will be that the people will set foot in the UK, they'll be detained for a period in the UK, and then they will be removed to a third country, as yet that third country has not been confirmed. There's been talks about Rwanda, there's been talks about Albania. The difficulty for the UK government will be that once the individuals have set foot on UK soil, their legal situation changes quite considerably, and it's entirely unclear to me how that legal situation will be resolved by the courts. So that's another difference between the Australian situation and that proposed in the UK. Thirdly, for people who do get to Nauru or Manus, Australia funds the processing of their asylum claims. In the UK, at this stage, there is no commitment to considering the asylum claims of the individuals who do make it to the UK, or indeed to the people who attempt to leave France and are detained. There is no clarity about whether their asylum claims will be considered. Thus, that's another important difference. Finally, Australia has a commitment to resettle those people who are found to be refugees, and at present, or until recently, those people had been being resettled in the US, and the remainder the Albanese government has said will be resettled in New Zealand. In respect of the UK policy, there is no equivalent resettlement responsibility accepted by the UK government. Thus, we have a very different situation in the UK at present. Having said that, I suspect the negotiations between the UK government, France, and the EU have a long way to go, and the legal issues still have a long way to go. So I think it's reasonable to say that UK policy is still in flux. I'd like to now just talk about the fifth wave of asylum seekers to Australia. Now, that wave was quite different to all previous waves of asylum seekers. Initially, because it was dominated by people from two nations arriving in Australia on visitor visas. The two nations were initially Malaysia and then subsequently China. The people arriving on visitor visas were, in my view, likely to have been assisted by organisers who were looking to convince those people that by agreeing to come to Australia on a visitor visa and then being assisted into jobs in Australia, predominantly working on farms, but some also working in other places, but predominantly on farms, they would be able to earn a substantial amount of money and be able to repay whatever debts they had to the organisers, have money to spare that they can send home and live a reasonable life in Australia. It is not clear that those three objectives were fulfilled for these people. Their applications for asylum were organised by their organisers. Most of the individuals concerned would not have gone through an agent, but rather through their organisers who arranged for their asylum applications to be lodged. Those asylum applications continue to be processed. It's not clear whether those people have yet repaid the debts they may have built up with their organisers, or indeed whether they've earned enough money to send money home, as was promised, or indeed lived a comfortable life in Australia. I suspect many of the individuals were misled. So how was that fifth wave different? Well, firstly, it was different because it was bigger than any previous wave. It was more than double the size of the number of Chinese students who were provided with a pathway to Australia after they'd applied for asylum. And certainly it was much bigger than any boat arrival cohort that has ever arrived in Australia. As I said, approximately 100,000 people. The second big difference between this wave and all previous waves is that this wave has a very high refusal rate, a refusal rate well over 90%. In respect to Malaysian and Chinese nationals, the refusal rate is over 95%, whereas all previous waves had a very high approval rate. Most of those people were being found to be genuine refugees. In this instance, they are being found not to be genuine refugees. To date, a little over 72,000 have been refused at the primary level, but have not yet departed. There are another of those 72,000, over 39,000 are currently appealing their decisions at the AAT. The vast bulk are being also refused at the AAT. And there are over 32,000 who have been refused at both the primary stage and the AAT, but have not yet departed. That 32,000 group would now have no work rights. They would essentially have no legal rights, and they would be in an extraordinarily vulnerable situation because their only way to survive would be to accept whatever job they can find at whatever rate of pay that's going. With the relatively strong labour market at the moment, most of them would be getting jobs at a reasonable rate of pay because the labour market's so strong. My suspicion is that won't be the same case if the labour market weakens. So that wave is a very, very different wave to all previous waves of asylum seekers. It is more similar to what we have seen in Europe and the United States. It's the first time we've seen something like this at scale in Australia. The sixth wave. The sixth wave started after international borders reopened and has been going for a little over 12 months. This graph gives you a feeling for those for the emergence of the sixth wave. As you can see, during the fifth wave, if you look at the blue bars, which is the monthly application rate, the blue bars are substantial before international borders close, but the number of people being processed, number of decisions being made, is significantly less than the number of applying, and as a result, we saw the backlogs rise and rise and rise. During the pandemic, the government was able to slightly increase the processing rate. The refusal rate remained as high as ever, but the processing rate increased, whilst the application rate fell. And indeed, there was a month in where it fell to as low as 600. Since then, and since the borders have reopened, as you can see in the last part of that graph, the blue lines can start to rise again. And those blue lines rising will continue. So they have now increased in the last month of data we have, that is January 23, they increased to 1,700. The peak that applications ever reached in the fifth wave was 2,500. But I have a suspicion sometime in 2023, we will have a month with more than 2,500. The processing rate remains much the same. It hasn't increased much, if at all. The refusal rate remains as high as ever. What that means is the backlog will now resume rising. And it's the backlog that's creating the opportunism, which is the way I described. This is not the sixth wave is not organized in the way the fifth wave was organized. The sixth wave is more about opportunism because of the existence of a very large backlog and the existence of very, very, very slow processing times. The sixth wave is also different because it is much broader in the range of nationalities that are applying. The three major nationalities that have emerged in the sixth wave are people from Indonesia, people from India, and people from Pacific Islands. In fact, if you take the totality of asylum applications in the sixth wave from Pacific Island nationals, they exceed the numbers from India, China, or Indonesia. So the sixth wave is once again quite different again. I might just stop it there just to give you a feel for, that was just to give you a feel for where we've been. I haven't talked much about where we might go, but I think it might be best if we open it up to questions and we can talk about where we might go in that context. Thanks very much, Graham.
Thank you, Abul, for the initial presentation. Australia is not the only country, obviously, facing these issues. We've seen in recent days some dreadful tragedies on the Mediterranean. There are constant problems in Central America. Are there lessons that Australia might take from other countries as to how they have handled the asylum seeker process in a humane way, but in a way that that stops it becoming totally chaotic?
I think I'm not aware of any country that's done this particularly well. Most countries are wrestling with this, and it is indeed a difficult problem. And how to deal with it humanely is in itself very difficult. I think the best example that I can think of any government in history handling this issue would have been the way the outflow from Vietnam was managed under the Comprehensive Plan of Action. And there were 3 or 4 characteristics of that that are really important. The first is cooperation between governments. There was a readiness for cooperation between Southeast Asian nations, the Vietnamese government, the new Vietnamese government, the United States, Australia, and indeed a number of other governments who were prepared to put together a structure which provided an incentive, a strong incentive for people not to get on boats, and it provided a humane and safe pathway to long-term permanent residence for the people who had been found to be refugees on in detention and they were held in detention in Hong Kong, in Malaysia, in Indonesia. I think that's probably the best template for us to think about in this space. Unfortunately, I think the issue has become, like so many issues, so polarized with so much suspicion both between nations and within nations on this issue that compromise and a sensible way forward has just become so much more difficult. I think the way the issue is handled in the United States is probably an example of the worst way to deal with this, where they have been essentially paralyzed now for 30 to 40 years. President Biden has put forward a new approach to this, which has some of the characteristics of the Comprehensive Plan of Action of the 70s. Whether he's going to be successful, I don't know. I think the difficulties he will find in Congress in terms of getting the money and getting support will be extraordinarily difficult. His policy is probably has got a greater chance of success, I think, than Mr. Trump's wall. But, you know, there are still people in the United States who believe a wall is a good idea.
Is there a problem in Australia's policies, a confusion between the different pathways, in that you talked about the fifth wave being mostly opportunism, of people seeking better economic situations rather than necessarily asylum seekers? And is that issue clouding the picture a lot so that we can't focus adequately on the refugee and asylum seeker issues rather than people seeking to move to Australia for other reasons?
Yes, I think that's certainly an issue. The difficulty is now that the backlog of asylum claims is now just so large that how we used to deal with those situations in the past are really not applicable, simply because the volumes are so big. To process those people properly and quickly would cost a fortune. The vast bulk of those people now applying through those fifth and sixth wave are not genuine refugees, and that's what's being found by the department at the primary stage, and it's what's being found by the AAT, and indeed that's what's being found by the courts. But once those people are refused, the numbers are so large that locating, detaining, and removing them would be an extraordinary task. It would cost a fortune. The politics of it would be just mind-bogglingly difficult. And as a result, I fear not much will happen about the fifth and sixth wave. And I fear that will undermine, I think, sympathies for genuine refugees. And it also undermines the asylum system for genuine refugees. Because as part of that cohort, there are genuine refugees in there. And they are not getting the rapid processing that they should be getting because the system is in such gridlock.
Now, questions from the audience? Or do we have any questions online?
Hi, Abul. I've got one question, two questions from our president, Paul Lucas. He asks, what relationship is there between asylum applications and ordinary migrant visa applications? And will a return to a well-structured migration policy reduce refugee protection claims or not, bearing in mind high rejection rates?
I think we have to look carefully at the group that is applying for asylum. There is a mixture of people from a range of countries who have predominantly come on visitor visas and have taken the opportunity to use asylum as a means of delaying departure. Because that means they are in Australia for 3-4 years, they often put down roots, and at the end of the process, don't really want to go home. And how the government deals with that group, I don't know. It used to be the case that that group was relatively small and governments could locate and remove those people. But as I said, the numbers are now just so big, that's not practical anymore. I really think a well-structured migration program can be used usefully in this space. So if we look at the situation of Pacific Islanders, and that's quite a unique situation, but it's relevant in this context because taken in totality, Pacific Island, there's more applications for asylum now from Pacific Islanders than from any other single nation. What we have is a program that provides those people with a pathway to temporary entry in Australia whilst they work on farms, essentially doing labouring work. And the government has announced that those people will have a pathway to permanent residence via what the government describes as a visa lottery. Two issues arise in that context. Broadly, I don't have a problem with what the government's trying to achieve in this space. And the primary objective is to increase and strengthen our relationship with Pacific Islands from a national security perspective. That makes entire sense. I can see why you'd want to do that. But two problems arise. One, whilst those people are on temporary visas in Australia picking fruit, the risk of exploitation is severe. And that's probably why so many are running away from their employers and applying for asylum. If they had a good job and were paid properly, my suspicion is they wouldn't run away from their employers nearly as quickly. The problem is going to be if the government says, well, we'll give you a chance of getting permanent residence if you enter this lottery. Two problems arise with that. One is, how long do you have to wait before you win the lottery? And what happens if you keep missing the lottery? I mean, you could be unlucky. What does that mean for you in terms of how long you have to put up with being exploited? Because the risk is the employer will say, look, if you want to enter this lottery, you've got to have a job offer. You'll rely on the job offer from me. You have to work for me so much longer, and I'll give you the job offer. And the employer strings them along on that basis. The individual is too scared to report the employer to authorities, and the exploitation continues. That's the first problem. The second problem is the pathway to permanent residence does not involve any sort of skills development. So the government has assumed that as soon as these people get permanent residence, they will leave, even though it's dependent on them having a job offer. The assumption is a lot of these people will end up on Social Security very quickly. That's the government's own assumption, which tells me that the government thinks most of these people will not take up the job offer that they're being provided and will move to the cities and be on welfare for some time, particularly if the labour market weakens. And that raises, I think, some serious issues. I think it would make a lot more sense if, one, I think we involve unions much more strongly in terms of dealing with the issue of exploitation. I think unions are the best placed to reduce the level of exploitation in this space because they're able to get the confidence of the workers and because they are not as fearful of the employer as the workers are going to be. Secondly, I think the workers should be provided with a skills development pathway to permanent residence, such that they are able to develop appropriate local trade skills and can then secure better paying long-term jobs and not be reliant on either back-breaking work for the rest of their lives picking fruit, which no one wants to do. I mean, it might be okay to pick fruit when you're 20, but picking fruit when you're 50s, that's a different thing. And I think by providing them with a skills development pathway to permanent residence, we can provide the individuals with a better future and also a greater chance of them staying in their local communities because they have developed those skills relevant to the local communities. I think the government can do this a lot better than it's doing at the moment.
Some analysts, including defence experts, are predicting there could be mass movements of people, refugees, in the next 30 years because of disasters made worse by climate change. I'm just wondering, has this process already started, maybe from some Pacific islands? And if it does, how would Australia be placed to cope with? I know it's fairly hypothetical at this stage, but
yeah,
interested to hear what you've got to say.
Well, it's certainly the case. I mean, I have a limited understanding of climate change, so I'm not in a position to say anything authoritative about that. But from my limited understanding, the people who may be affected first may well be some of these Pacific islands.
Yeah.
And I think Australia providing those people with a pathway to permanent residence in Australia makes sense as its appropriate response. But as I said, I think the pathway should respect the individuals and provide them with not just a pathway to permanent residence, but a pathway to a good job.
Yeah. Thank you.
Dr. Rizvi, we've not spoken, I think, about any of the international refugee conventions to which Australia is a party, or the UK or whatever. Does this mean that those conventions are no longer fit for purpose? If so, should we seek to renegotiate them or simply accept they're not going to work anyway? Individual countries are going to do what they want to do anyway.
Well, certainly the UK seems to have decided it's going to do what it wants to do and will find a way by hook or by crook. It is the case that the Refugee Convention was first enacted in 1956. The protocol associated with that was signed off in 1967, and that particular part of international law, I think, is problematic. Many governments are now modifying how they interpret that for their own purposes. So, for example, the UK is now saying if you have passed through, or the US and the UK are saying, but the US in particular is now saying, if you have passed through a third country, a safe third country, and you fail to apply for asylum in that third country, the US does not have to consider you if you make an asylum application in the US. Strictly speaking, I think that is contrary to the convention, but that is the way Mr. Biden has decided to go. And assuming the courts in the US support him and the Congress supports him, he will have effectively modified the Refugee Convention for the purposes of his administration.
Another online question.
This question is from Wendy Flannery. Are there asylum seekers from some countries more likely to be accepted than others?
Yes, very much so. So if you are an asylum seeker from, say, Myanmar, if you're an asylum seeker from Afghanistan or Iran, your chances of being accepted are probably above 80 or 90%. Absolutely. If you are an asylum seeker from the United Kingdom, and we've had 20 or 30 odd asylum seekers from the United Kingdom in the last 12 months, they were all refused. I don't know whether they went home, though.
I have another online question from Nicole Haggerty. In 2021, Labor promised to abolish TPVs. Their announcement last month does not do that. Why do you believe they have chosen not to do so?
Well, what they've done is provided the TPV holders with a pathway to permanent residence. You can only abolish a visa once there are no people on it and once there are no applications for TPVs. At the moment, we have a large number of people who are holders of TPVs, and we have a large number of people still being processed for TPVs. So you can't abolish it until those two conditions are met.
Dr. Rizvi, you talked about some ideas that you have that could make our refugee and asylum process more sustainable. You talked in respect to ideas for the civic. Could you expand on some other ideas that could go towards a more sustainable system?
Oh, look, undoubtedly, in my view, the Gillard government's proposal for the agreement with Malaysia would have been both much, much less expensive and much, much more humane than what we ended up with. Unfortunately, where we are now in terms of boat arrival policy, where both the major parties are now more or less aligned on policy, other than in respect of TPVs, means that to get away from that, even if there is something better on the horizon, will be extraordinarily difficult. I suspect we are stuck with what we've got.
But you do see that there are opportunities such as what you described for the civic that could improve the situation.
Yes, of course, the people from the Pacific aren't actually arriving on boats. They're arriving on aeroplanes, they're arriving on visas, and they have been processed for those visas. They are subsequently applying for asylum, predominantly because they're running away from their employers. And one of the conditions of their visa is that they need to remain with an approved employer. Once they run away from their employers, they don't have a job. And the risk for them is that they would become unlawful. They're applying for asylum essentially to avoid becoming unlawful.
Any other questions?
Sorry for second dipping, but when the Albanese government announced its changes, the temporary protection visas, some of the people on those could go have a pathway. Certain sections of the media and the coalition said, "Here we go again. The boats will be coming next week." They didn't. What
Yes.
would it, so
that was no surprise.
So what? So the protections we have in place are obviously working. What would it take to restart the boats?
I mean, some people argue that turn-back policy is sufficient and you don't need to have the fallback of offshore processing. That may or may not be true. I don't know. We've never tested that. My suspicion is the government won't test that because if a boat did get through, they would want to have the fallback of offshore processing. And for that reason, I suspect both of those policies will remain in place. And as a result, I don't believe there will be any boats whilst those two policies are in place. I think the coalitions and some parts of the media telling us that there would be a flood of boats when TPVs were abolished was complete hyperbole. And I think Mr. Dutton should be held to account for having made those comments.
Sure.
Many of us are watching the new Ken Burns documentary on SBS iView on the USA and the Holocaust and how the United States responded to that situation during the 1930s. The Attorney General, Mr. Dreyfus, has talked about his own family escaping from the Holocaust from Austria, if I understand, and how grateful he is to Australia. Do you think that the sentiment that unfortunately has developed in Australia over the last 20 years of almost demonisation of asylum seekers might be softening at all?
I'd like to think so. I think now that there is some bipartisanship in terms of boat policy, leaving aside the issue of TPVs, I think gives Australia the opportunity to be more generous in terms of its offshore humanitarian program. That offshore humanitarian program is at the moment around 13,500 per annum, plus the special 4,500 for Afghan refugees. So that takes us to just over 18, I think about 18,000 or so places. Historically, Australia has had a humanitarian program between 10 and 20,000 per annum. So we are now towards the higher end of that range. I think there would be merit once the 4,500 per annum special intake from Afghanistan expires for the government to renew a humanitarian program of around that level. I think there would be merit in doing that for good humanitarian reasons, but also I think it's important, if that was to be sustained, that we look closely at our settlement policies. I think too often governments expand the humanitarian program without thinking of the long-term issues in terms of settlement and fail to fund the settlement programs adequately. My preference would be to be, if money is short, and money's almost always short, it would be better to increase the program by a smaller amount and have better settlement policies than to increase the program by a large amount, have politicians, beat their chest and say how wonderful they are, and then fail to fund the settlement programs adequately. That, in my view, is worse than the alternative.
Okay, one last question.
So I've got one from Catherine Crittenden online. While we have been fixated on boats, the system has been overwhelmed by people arriving by air. What has been done to address this?
To date, not very much, unfortunately. I think this issue will remain largely hidden from the Australian public for a number of reasons. Firstly, the problem arose when Mr. Dutton was Immigration Minister. He will not be eager to draw attention to it. Secondly, for the Albanese government to address this issue would cost a fortune. It simply does not have the budget to address the issue, and therefore there is no incentive to talk about it. Thirdly, in respect of the Greens, having large numbers of people who are refused for asylum runs contrary to much of their language in this space. The Greens will not want to talk about it, neither will asylum advocates. Because high refusal rates for people applying for asylum doesn't sit comfortably with their thinking. So we essentially have all of the major political players in this space don't want to talk about this. And I suspect you won't hear much more about this until the numbers become so large that no one can ignore it.
Well, thank you, Dr. Rizvi. That's an extraordinary, comprehensive discussion of many of the challenges that there are in this area. Could I ask you to express your appreciation to the fellow?
Yeah.
Dr.
Rizvi, that was a very concise, lucid explanation of a very complex area. So thank you once again. Now, you spoke to us last year, and you remember.
Yes.
So fantastic. So you're a member for another year.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
I'd like to, everyone to put your hands together.
Thank you very much.
Right, we've got a very packed program coming up. On March 28, we've got On the Couch, A Life in Diplomacy. This is the former senior diplomat Ian Kemish, who's going to be interviewed by AIIA Queensland President Paul Lucas. Now, Ian has been at the centre of things. He served as head of Australia's consular service at the time of the Bali bombings and the 9/11 attacks in the US. So this is an absolute must if you want a career in diplomacy. To something more direct. April 11, the Russia-Ukraine war. Continuity, change and the future. Presentation by retired Major General Mick Ryan. Now Mick Ryan, he's a guy with an impressive CV. He spent 35 years in the Australian Army. He is now an adjunct professor at the University of Queensland. And he's got a high media profile. Anyone reads the SMH or the Age in the past week will know that Mick Ryan is part of a panel of experts who's made some rather alarming prophecies. One is that Australia could face the prospect of armed conflict in the Indo-Pacific within 3 years. So keep your eye on that one.